What happens when a single mom unexpectedly helps a millionaire fix his car? It's not just the car that gets repaired, it's his view on life. But when he notices the unexpected symbol on her finger, everything changes. On a quiet afternoon, the highway stretched ahead, framed by rows of trees casting shadows on the tarmac. The light from the afternoon's sun danced on the pavement, the warmth of the day lingering in the air. Rachel had just finished another exhausting shift at the diner, and the drive back home was the only time she allowed herself to breathe. The thought of her son, Ben, waiting for her at home, kept her going. His smile and energy were what powered her through her long hours of work. As she navigated the winding road, the hum of her aging sedan was a comfort, a reminder of the little things in life that helped her keep going. Her life had become a routine of work, raising her son, and dealing with the challenges that came with being a single mother. She didn't have time for much else. Her focus was always on providing for Ben, making sure he had everything he needed, and juggling multiple jobs to make ends meet. Time for herself had become a distant luxury, one that was often pushed aside for more immediate concerns. Yet, despite the challenges, Rachel had learned to make do with what she had, and she carried herself with a quiet strength that came from years of persistence. As she rounded a curve on the road, something unusual caught her eye. A sleek, black car sat stalled by the side of the highway. It was an odd sight, a stark contrast to the surrounding rural landscape. The car looked out of place, polished and pristine, a symbol of wealth and status, which was foreign to the stretch of highway she found herself on. Rachel glanced at it briefly, then focused back on the road, her mind already drifting back to the familiar concerns of her day. But something in the back of her mind nudged her to take a second look. She wasn't sure why. It wasn't like her to interfere with other people's problems. She was tired, and the last thing she needed was to get involved in something she didn't have the time or energy for. Yet, as her car continued down the road, she felt a slight pull to turn around. It wasn't her usual instinct to stop for strangers, but today was different. Maybe it was the fact that she could tell the man standing beside the car seemed frustrated, pacing and trying in vain to figure out the issue. Or perhaps it was just the glimmer of something new, something different from the monotony of her life, that beckoned her. Without giving it much more thought, she turned her steering wheel, her car's tires crunching against the gravel shoulder as she pulled over. She didn't know what she was expecting to find, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something about the situation required her attention. Stepping out of her vehicle, she noticed the man standing next to the luxury car. He was tall, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the rugged surroundings. His posture was tense, as if the situation was something he couldn't handle, despite the confidence his attire seemed to suggest. As Rachel approached, she could see the frustration etched across his face. He wasn't just standing there, he was actively attempting to figure out what was wrong with the car, opening the hood and poking around inside like he was trying to solve a puzzle. His hands were shaking slightly, the kind of nervous energy that only comes from the lack of control over a situation. It was almost comical, the image of such an elegantly dressed man standing helplessly beside a broken-down car. But there was something more to it, something that made Rachel stop. She didn't know it yet, but the man's frustration mirrored something deeper. The kind of helplessness that most people, especially those who had never had to deal with difficult situations, weren't accustomed to. Her decision to stop wasn't a dramatic one. It wasn't the result of a profound moment of selflessness or a burning desire to make a difference. It was simply an instinct. Rachel had spent her life learning to read people, to understand their needs, even when they weren't voiced. Her time as a waitress had sharpened that skill, as she was constantly attuned to the moods and body language of others. And something about the man, standing there with his hands on the hood of his car, screaming silently for help, resonated with her. Without thinking much more, Rachel called out, "Need a hand?" The words slipped from her lips almost effortlessly, her voice cutting through the silence. She didn't know much about cars, but she knew a thing or two about offering a helping hand when someone seemed to need it. The man turned toward her, a flash of surprise crossing his face. He looked at her with a brief, almost amused expression. probably wondering why the stranger in jeans and a t-shirt had offered help. But something in his expression softened as he considered her. For a moment, there was hesitation. Rachel could see it in his eyes. He didn't want to admit that he couldn't fix the car. But then his shoulders dropped, and with a sigh, he stepped aside. "I don't suppose you know anything about cars?" he asked, his voice tinged with both frustration and reluctant hope. Rachel smiled, a simple, reassuring smile. "Not much, but I've fixed a few things here and there. Can't hurt to try, right?" The man glanced at her, then at the engine, and after a second of quiet deliberation, he nodded. Rachel moved in closer, peering under the hood. She wasn't a mechanic by any means, but years of dealing with her own car had given her the basic skills to spot problems. The issue seemed simple enough, a loose battery connection. She could do this. With quick, confident movements, she tightened the connection, making sure it was secure. As she stepped back, she wiped her hands on a rag she always kept in the car. She hadn't even considered the fact that this man might have been someone important, someone out of her social circle. In that moment, it didn't matter. He was just another person who needed help. That was all Rachel saw. No title, no wealth, no status. Just a man who needed a fix, and she was more than willing to offer it. She didn't expect a thank you, nor did she expect anything more. But when the car roared to life, the sound of the engine purring smoothly, she felt a quiet satisfaction. Rachel knew she'd done something good, even if it was a small thing. It was just another moment in her day, but for Ethan, the millionaire, it was the beginning of something he hadn't anticipated. As Rachel turned to leave, she gave him a quick wave, ready to return to her routine. But as she did, the man's eyes locked onto something. It wasn't her face or her hands. It was something more subtle, the simple gold ring on her finger. And in that moment, something shifted. There was a story behind the ring. And that story would change everything. This was no ordinary encounter. Ethan, accustomed to a life surrounded by wealth and privilege, had rarely encountered people who didn't act according to his expectations. In his world, problems were solved by hiring the best professionals, not by relying on the kindness of strangers. He had grown used to dealing with high-powered individuals, executives, and service providers who offered solutions based on expertise and status. But when his luxury car broke down on a quiet stretch of highway, none of that mattered. There he was, standing beside his car, trying and failing to figure out the issue, feeling utterly helpless in the face of an unexpected challenge. He was used to control, to being the one who dictated the course of events. But now, standing alone in the middle of nowhere, his carefully curated sense of self-assurance was unraveling. He never imagined that someone like Rachel would stop and offer help. At first, he thought she was just another passerby, maybe someone curious about his car, but her straightforward offer to assist caught him off guard. The simplicity of it, the casual way she approached the situation, was the first surprise. She didn't fawn over his car, didn't try to impress him with any pretense. She simply offered her help, no strings attached. When Rachel quickly identified the issue and fixed the loose battery connection, Ethan was stunned. It wasn't just that she had helped him. It was the ease with which she had done so, as though it were a routine part of her life. Here was this woman, dressed in practical clothes, standing in stark contrast to the polished world he was used to, yet she seemed entirely competent. He had expected someone else, perhaps a mechanic or a professional, to handle this situation. Instead, it was Rachel, someone with no apparent connection to his world, who had the ability to solve the problem. In that moment, Ethan saw a side of life he rarely encountered. It wasn't about status, wealth, or power. It was about raw competence, grounded humility, and the kind of kindness that didn't need recognition. Rachel's simplicity and self-assuredness left him questioning his own assumptions about the people around him. There was so much more to her than the initial impression he had made. This wasn't just about a car being fixed. It was about a person who knew who they were and didn't need anything else. As Rachel prepared to leave, Ethan's gaze lingered for a moment longer than usual. He had thanked her for her help, but something caught his attention that made him pause. It was subtle, almost unnoticed at first, but there it was, a simple gold ring on her finger. In a world where he was surrounded by flashy displays of wealth, extravagant jewelry, and brand name accessories, the ring stood out not because of its opulence, but because of its simplicity. It wasn't the kind of thing he was accustomed to seeing on someone like her. The understated design was far removed from the extravagance of the items Ethan was used to, and it intrigued him. Ethan had spent years navigating the world of luxury, custom tailored suits, rare watches, diamonds, and gold that gleamed with status. He had never thought much of simple jewelry. It had always seemed too ordinary, too plain. But this ring was different. It wasn't meant to show off wealth or sophistication. It was personal. The way Rachel wore it, casually with no hint of pride or arrogance, made it clear that the ring wasn't just an accessory. It was a symbol of something deeper, something more significant. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of it. A ring like that could mean so many things. Was it an heirloom? A family memento passed down through generations? Or was it something more intimate, more personal? Ethan couldn't help but wonder about the story behind it. Who had given it to her? Why did she wear it so comfortably, almost as though it was part of her identity? To him, it was a mystery, a puzzle that only made him more curious about Rachel's life and what lay beneath her seemingly simple exterior. The more Ethan thought about it, the more the ring consumed his thoughts. It represented something far beyond material wealth. It was a marker of life's deeper connections of history and memory. And for someone like Ethan, who had always been surrounded by people chasing status and fleeting desires, that simplicity, that quiet significance, was something entirely new and utterly compelling. Ethan's curiosity, sparked by the fleeting encounter on the roadside, led him back to the diner where Rachel worked. The more he thought about her, the more questions filled his mind. It wasn't just about the ring anymore. It was about her life, her experiences, and the quiet strength she carried. What had shaped her into the person he had encountered that day? There was something about Rachel that intrigued him on a level he hadn't expected. The simplicity with which she had handled the car problem, the lack of pretension or desperation, suggested a depth to her character that he couldn't ignore. When Ethan returned to the diner, he was no longer looking for answers to a fleeting curiosity. He was searching for understanding, a glimpse into a life so different from his own. Rachel's life, filled with challenges and perseverance, contrasted sharply with the wealth and privilege that had always defined his world. There was a sense of resilience in her that was more profound than anything he had encountered in his circle. It was a quiet strength not born from money or power, but from necessity, the necessity of surviving, of building a life with what little she had. As they spoke, Rachel shared the story of her late husband, the one who had given her the ring. She explained that the ring wasn't just an object, it was a reminder of a love that had been torn away too soon. Her husband had been a soldier, and his death had left a hole in her life that she had never truly been able to fill. Yet, despite the grief, Rachel had pressed on. She had no choice. Her son needed her, and life demanded that she keep moving forward even when the weight of loss threatened to crush her. For Ethan, hearing Rachel's story was like being shaken awake from a long slumber. The contrast between her strength and his own life of comfort was stark. Rachel had faced hardship, yet she had not been defeated by it. She had built a life from the ground up, raising her son with a resilience he couldn't fathom. Ethan, who had always been surrounded by the comforts of wealth, began to question everything he had taken for granted: love, loss, and the way he had approached life. Rachel's story left him grappling with a new understanding of strength, one that came from deep within, shaped by experiences far different from his own. As the days passed, Ethan found himself reflecting more and more on the encounter with Rachel. What had initially seemed like a chance meeting had, in fact, left a much deeper impact on him than he cared to admit. He had gone into the interaction with the expectation that he would help her understand something about herself or her life, but instead, he had learned something profound about his own. For years, Ethan had lived in a world where success was defined by numbers, the number of zeros in his bank account, the size of his office, the weight of his possessions. He had worked tirelessly to build his empire, driven by a need to prove himself, to secure his place among the influential and the powerful. The people he surrounded himself with shared similar values. Their worth was measured by the achievements they had accumulated, and their happiness, he believed, was tied to the accolades they could garner. But Rachel had shown him a different way of living. Her life was not defined by financial success nor by titles or possessions. Her strength came from the simple but profound ways in which she had navigated hardship. Rachel had experienced loss that most people couldn't imagine, yet she stood firm, her life shaped by the love she still carried for her late husband and the love she poured into raising her son. In her, Ethan saw a kind of resilience that was far more valuable than any wealth he could ever accumulate. The quiet way in which she carried her burdens, the love she continued to hold for her late husband, and the way she put her son's needs first, all of these things had shaped Rachel into someone remarkable. Her life wasn't defined by accolades or material success, but by the connections she had formed, the integrity with which she lived, and the values she held dear. She hadn't allowed life's challenges to break her. Instead, they had only deepened her sense of purpose and love. And in that quiet strength, Ethan found something he hadn't realized he was searching for: a life of meaning that wasn't reliant on external achievements. The more Ethan thought about it, the more he realized how disconnected he had become from what really mattered. In his pursuit of success, he had ignored the very things that gave life its true depth, love, connection, and purpose. He had surrounded himself with material wealth and accolades, but in doing so, he had lost sight of the simple joys that came from living a life rooted in something real. He had been so focused on climbing the ladder, accumulating wealth, and proving himself to others that he hadn't taken the time to truly understand what made life worth living. Rachel's life, by comparison, was not filled with the kind of lavish excesses that defined his world, but it was richer in ways that Ethan could not ignore. Her strength, forged through years of hardship, had built a life that was grounded in love, a love for her son, a love for her late husband, and a love for the simple acts of kindness and generosity that shaped her every day. It was in these things that Ethan saw what true wealth looked like. It was not about the money you accumulated, but the lives you touched and the love you gave. As Ethan sat back and thought about his own life, he couldn't help but feel a sense of emptiness creeping in. Despite his success and the wealth he had earned, he realized that he had been living a life disconnected from the things that truly mattered. His achievements had been for himself, a way to validate his worth, a way to prove he could achieve anything. But in the process, he had neglected the deeper connections and values that gave life its meaning. For the first time, Ethan found himself questioning the very foundation of his life. Was it possible to have true fulfillment without the constant pursuit of success? Was it possible to live a life that mattered without relying on status, wealth, or achievement? The more he thought about Rachel's quiet strength, the more he realized that true fulfillment wasn't about what you had, but what you gave, the love you shared, the people you supported, and the connections you built along the way. In that moment, Ethan recognized that his life, filled with money and success, lacked something far more essential: meaning. He had spent so much of his life focusing on external markers of success that he had failed to cultivate the internal qualities that made a life truly rich. Rachel, despite her challenges, had a deep sense of meaning in her life, one that came from the love she gave and the strength she showed every day. Her life wasn't easy, but it was full of purpose, and that purpose was rooted in something far more important than the material wealth that had dominated his own life. The realization was both humbling and liberating. Ethan understood that he had been chasing the wrong things. He had been focused on proving himself to others, building an empire that, in the end, didn't give him the sense of fulfillment he had hoped for. Rachel had taught him that success didn't have to be measured by the size of your bank account or the title you held. True success was about living a life that was rich in connection, purpose, and love. And in that moment, Ethan knew that he had a choice to make: to continue down the path he had been on, or to shift his focus toward what truly mattered. As he left the diner that day, Ethan couldn't shake the thought of Rachel's life, the quiet strength, and the love that defined her every action. In her, he saw the kind of life he had always longed for: but had never known how to achieve. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan wondered if his life, filled with all its success and accomplishments, could ever truly be as meaningful as Rachel's. Could he, too, live a life of love, connection, and quiet strength, free from the need for external validation? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. The encounter with Rachel had altered his perspective in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend, and in doing so, it had opened the door to a life he had never imagined for himself. If you're inspired by stories of resilience and real connections, don't forget to subscribe to Expect Stories for more powerful narratives that will move and motivate you.